Hi, my name is Kim Barthel, and I'm a Canadian occupational therapist with a deep love of neurobiology, sensory processing, attachment, movement, and trauma. I have the honor to speak to you from British Columbia, Canada, where I live, work, and play on the ancestral unceded territory of the Woo-Saanich and Coast Salish peoples. Once upon a time, the Hong Kong Sensory Integration Society asked me, Kim, can you speak about sleep? And my response was, I think I've given 30 different workshop series in my career. And peripherally, at some point in every workshop, there is an interface with the topic of sleep. Every single functional challenge that a person has interacts with sleep. So I agreed to create this inquiry into the topic of sleep, which could be a life's work. The amount of research, the amount of information could be a life's work. This series, across 4 webinar sessions, is going to talk about the science of sleep, which is so incredibly important in understanding what we do to support sleep-related issues. So if you find yourself in this first session wanting to know, well, what do I do? Or I have this client and I want to know what to do, I'm going to ask you to wait. Because this first session is a deep dive into what happens inside our physiology during sleep. The second session, which is also very intense, is going to examine sleep across the lifespan and all of the different challenges that relate to sleep in a wide variety of diagnostic categories. Session number 3 is going to look at treatment with a focus on sensory processing, with an understanding of different tools that can be provided. And session 4 is going to look at the environment, adaptations to the environment, and alternatives in sleep support. So I invite you to sink in to this information with me. And here we go. The science of sleep. Thank you also to the Hong Kong Occupational Therapy Association for collaborating with the Hong Kong SI Society in making this workshop possible, not only for Hong Kong, but now in this webinar platform for the world. Why do we sleep? Because we spend a lot of time doing it. When the lights go out, our brains actually work. Sleep is not a passive state. It is not a passive state. It is not a turning off of the brain and the mind. There is a tremendous amount of activity, of purpose, and of metabolic energy that happens when we sleep. One of the primary purposes of sleep is to clean the brain and to sort through the data that we enter into our minds, into our nervous systems on a day-to-day basis. It helps us make sense out of the world in which we live. It also is like the cleaning up on your computer that does all of the analysis of your hard drive and evaluates your RAM, how effective your computer is running. When you're sleeping, your brain and your body evaluates itself, looks at what are my hormone levels? How are the enzymes in my system genetically configurate? What's the configuration of the genes that produce my enzymes? And it also is a tremendous balancer for the immune system. So we're going to understand this interplay of these physiological processes that happen when we sleep. There are thousands of papers and many journals dedicated to this conversation of sleep. But there were some very beautiful synopses of the science of sleep, and one was created by Time magazine. So you will see that as a reference throughout this workshop repeatedly, because I found that in this Time collaboration, they drew from many of the best authors on the subject of sleep from around the world. So we have different stages of sleep that are rapidly altering and changing throughout the time that we are resting, and they have different purposes and different phenomenon that are happening inside of our brain and our body. The first aspect of sleep is called non-REM sleep. So non-rapid eye movement sleep. And the first stage is that time when you first lie down in the bed and you're kind of awake and you're relaxing and you're not quite asleep yet. This is a very transitory stage. It's a transition to sleep. This is where a lot of people encounter difficulties with insomnia. This period of time typically lasts between 5 to 10 minutes when the sleep cycle is balanced. So this is like driving your car and you take the gears and you shift into a lower gear. The system starts to transition from one state of arousal to another state of arousal. Non-REM stage 2 is a pretty interesting phase of change in brainwave activity. And we're going to talk about sleep spindles momentarily, but this is a shift in brainwave activity that looks very spiky on an EEG that significantly alters an arousal state towards deep sleep. The body temperature drops, heart rate starts to slow, and it usually lasts about 20 minutes after you first fall asleep. Then you enter into non-REM stage 3. The muscles start to relax. The blood pressure and the breathing rate drops. And this is where you sleep very deeply. From there, we shift into rapid eye movement. This is a highly active state where the body becomes very relaxed and the muscles are immobilized. This is where we dream and the eyes move rapidly. So as we start our investigation of these different stages of sleep, we are going to understand them because different neurodevelopmental disabilities, different forms of diagnosis, such as pain or movement disorders, have disruptions in these different stages of sleep. So this foundational knowledge is necessary for us to understand what is happening in different situations neurobiologically as we support our clients functionally. As we enter sleep, the earliest phases of sleep, we're still relatively awake and alert. For 20 years, I have been talking about arousal. It's one of my biggest neurobiological focuses in my career. I have a book in my bookshelf that is this thick by Dr. Pfaff on the neurobiology of arousal, because arousal is so foundational to self-regulation, to sensory processing, and to why people do what they do, stress responses. So sleep, ironically, is a big conversation about arousal. And this is where you'll start to see the interface between some of the subjects we talk about every day in behavior with a phenomenon that we might not think about that much as it relates to behavior. So this state of awake and alertness is moving into a direction away from rapid beta, alert thinking into a slower alpha wave. And the alpha wave you can see in the chart here has a greater pitch and roll in the curve because there is less activity or activation of the neuronal structures as we start to transition to sleep. One of the greatest difficulties in sleep disorders is in this phase. And that's why it's so important. Many people experience, as you'll see right at the end of this conversation, hyper-arousal, where beta wave just doesn't give up. And there's difficulty with this shift in transition from awake and conscious to awake, relaxed, and decreased consciousness. Interestingly, as we are falling asleep, but we're not quite yet there, this is a strange state. And there's a lot of lack of filtration, for a better word, of sensations. And it's known as hypnagogic, where sensations seem to be arising from within that are like experiencing sensations from without. They're hallucinatory in nature. And they happen the most when you're falling asleep or first waking up in this transition phase of alpha wave. And that's where you might have that feeling of, I'm falling. You know, if you've ever had that sensation where you're in that mid-arousal phase and you feel like you've just fallen backwards, or you're falling off a cliff, or you're flying. These would be examples of those hypnagogic hallucinations that are sensory in nature, but they're not reality-based. And all of these interesting things are not well yet understood. You also might hear someone calling your name, and it may wake you up, and you might look around and think, well, there's no one here. So this is a very sensory elicited state of being where sensations and memories may rise to the surface of consciousness in this transitory phase. It's very common for muscles to twitch during this transition phase, where you'll see, or if you're ever with a bedmate and they're falling asleep, their body may jerk, and they're called myoclonic jerks. And this is the muscles beginning to relax. It's a form of tetany, where there's a release of tension in the muscles in these states of transition. In my attempt to understand non-REM sleep, because I didn't realize how profoundly different these different phases were and how different their purposes were. Most of our sleep is non-REM. Up to 80% is characterized by this form of sleep. And here you'll have this phenomenon called sleep spindles. And this is a description of an EEG pattern. If you're wearing an EEG cap, which looks like you're getting your hair streaked at the hairdresser, you've got this very sophisticated cap on your head that is measuring electrical activity through the scalp, and very common in sleep studies. You'll see these sharp spikes known as spindles, and there's high, slow delta waves of electrical activity. So if you go back and you look at that bottom part of the chart here, see how it goes up and then it's kind of flat, and it goes up and then it's flat. And so when it has that rise, that's the spindle that we're speaking about. And this is where there's a deep disconnection from the body, a deep disconnection from the body senses. So part of the role of the brain in this phase, in this delta phase, is to decrease the processing of exteroception, so that sensory information from my body, from the environment, is less processed or affected in the nervous system's registration, so that I can stay in a deep level of consciousness, unconsciousness, in order to sleep. So in this deep sleep, the way I process proprioception, vestibular information, tactile information from my body, I become somewhat disembodied, and that allows me to be unconscious and truly restful in my state. This is necessary in order to form what we call declarative memory. Now that's memory of specific events, facts, and recall memory. So what did I have for breakfast yesterday? What did I wear yesterday? Information that I've gathered throughout my day is sorted, organized, and stored during this phase of sleep. And that's why it's so critical, because learning, if you're a child or an adult, it only becomes, as we call, potentiated or hardwired in this time. I remember cramming for exams in university, staying awake all night, thinking this is how I'm going to remember. What we now know is the best way to consolidate memory is to sleep. That's where the brain makes sense of the information. cramming the information in here doesn't actually embody or become part of you until the brain has a distance from the information. Very interesting, isn't it? This is also the time in this phase where short-term memory gets transferred into long-term memory. The hippocampus is so highly involved in this particular phase. So all of that memorization that I did for cramming in that exam, while I'm sleeping, that's where it becomes nicely organized in a file drawer in my brain, so that tomorrow when I write that exam, I'm going to be able to open that file drawer and be able to access that information. Sleep and rest is one of the most powerful forms of organization for cognition. When you're sleeping deeply, which is that non-REM place, this is when you release growth hormone in the body, which of course in infancy and childhood and adolescence, it's massive. But you're also going to hear me talk about a special kind of neuron called an adult-born neuron, which is adult neuroplasticity. That means healing in the brain that requires growth hormone. So when you're sleeping, there's growth, but there's also repair. There's also genetic replication that happens in a much more organized and healthy manner during sleep. Your mitochondria, I've been reading the work of Navio, which is an author, Naviaux, Navio, talking about cell danger. And cell danger is when the mitochondria which are the furnaces of your cells, are either hijacked by genetics or they lose their capacity by environmental interaction, very common in autism. And this is where in sleep, the cell danger phenomenon can experience repair because those little furnaces that make our cells more competent, they have all of their cellular organization occur during sleep. So if you're interested in understanding mitochondria at a deeper level, that's why I say every slide could be its own workshop. Sleep is where the furnaces of our cells become more capable and give us more energy in the daytime. You also, as I said, have this capacity for learning and curiosity and motivation and creativity that arise from the neurochemical balance that happens only in deep sleep. I love talking about neurotransmitters. Talk about being a bit of a neuro nerd. Because neurotransmitters, for me, help me understand what is an upregulation or a downregulation of arousal at different times. And we're going to start our conversation around the different kinds of chemicals that live in different parts of the brain that contribute to sleep. Sleep is not just a downregulation phenomenon. It's a combination of up and down through different stages of sleep. So we have many different neurochemicals that instigate these phases and participate in these transitions. Why this is important is all of the neurodiverse people that we support and diagnostic criteria that we support have difficulties with different neurotransmitters. So when we talk about psychiatric disorders, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Parkinson's, as a few examples, we have to understand the neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep are also interacting with other behavioral manifestations in these different diagnoses. So let's talk about serotonin. First, serotonin, the chemical of middle. That's what Kim says. The chemical that keeps you in the middle. I call it a modulator. Brings you up when you're down and down when you're up, and keeps you in this window of available, alert, and engaged. So it is a balancer. If I think about our brain as a bucket, a big pail full of different chemicals, those chemicals all have relationships with each other. And they have to be balanced in number in order for that bucket to not spill over, but also to have enough in it to work properly. Well, serotonin is a big boss in this process and really makes the other chemicals, it's kind of like, you do this, you do this, you do this. It's a director of the symphony and keeps all of the other players organized. That's why I chose to talk about it first. A key chemical, which is a hormone, in sleep is melatonin. And melatonin, which you're going to hear about shortly, is part of creating what we call the circadian rhythm. When should I wake up? When should I go to sleep? The when. Being someone who travels all the time, not at the moment, but generally speaking, jet lag is a common experience for my being, and this would be a problem with the when. I really need to be sleeping right now, but I'm supposed to be awake while I'm in Hong Kong. And then when I come back home, the same thing happens. This is guided by your melatonin system. So serotonin is produced inside of a gland that's deep inside your brain that is called the pineal gland. And it is kind of like the chemical foundation for melatonin. So what makes that important? If my serotonin levels are low, or if they are out of balance, then my melatonin is going to be altered. And this is what you see, especially in kids with autism, especially in people with depression, in many different disorders. The serotonin levels, if they're not foundational, sleep is altered at a chemical level. So serotonin, ironically, is mostly produced in the gut. Isn't that interesting? Your gut has its own brain. I always say 80% of your chemicals up here in your head are developed here in your gut. So if my population of bacteria in my gut is not healthy, and this is a challenge for so many people, if my inflammatory process in my gut are activated, if I have reflux, if I have IBS, inflammatory bowel syndrome, if I have celiacs, if I'm constipated, then my serotonin production in my gut is altered, which will subsequently affect my sleep. This mind-body connection. So health of the gut impacts the health of our brain and our sleep, and vice versa. So serotonin balance is necessary. So you can imagine that in one of the tools that we're going to talk about, it's going to be about food. It's going to be about bacteria, because that is going to help in this regulatory function. Norepinephrine. Why are we talking about adrenaline when we talk about sleep? This was my question. Like, really? We need adrenaline to sleep? The answer is yes. Adrenaline to me is like the fight-flight chemical. I always thought of adrenaline as the thing that happens to me when I watch a scary movie or when I jump out of an airplane, which I've never done. But adrenaline is what makes my heart race, what makes my blood pressure go up, which creates my experiences of fear. Well, because the home of arousal is the reticular activating system, which is such an important structure to occupational therapists who think about sensory processing. The reticular activating system is about alertness. And so, not just falling asleep, but alertness. So it's loaded with receptors for adrenaline. There's a structure in there that I've been talking about for a long time called the locus coeruleus, which is the blue nucleus. That's what it stains as when you look at it through an electron microscope. The cells dye blue. And it's in the pons, which is part of the brainstem. The reticular activating system fills a large part of your brainstem. And what's so interesting about these cells is that they are novelty detectors. Is that new in my environment? Because your survival depends on it. So anytime a new stimulus comes into your environment, into your experience, the brain needs to orient to it. It's called the orienting response. So the locus coeruleus, which is part of your reticular activating system, is all about novelty detection. And one of the things we know about, for example, one particular population is people with attention deficit, is that novelty, think about video games, gives them a greater degree of orienting, alertness, focus, because the more novelty in the environment, the more this structure lights up and shouts out to the whole brain, pay attention. And many of us are adapting to our environment. The more we use this, the more common we are hitting our brains with novelty, the more this structure needs in order to stay focused. So what has this got to do with sleep? Well, one of the places that this goes, this locus coeruleus, it goes to a lot of places, but it goes to the diencephalon, the forebrain, and the cerebellum. And it's all sensory. Everything processed in your reticular activating system is sensory. So all this sensory data, there's a sound, there's a bird flying by the window, there's somebody moving in the room beside me, there's a kid that just hit another kid behind me in the desk. The brainstem is taking this in, and it sends this information to other places in the brain to be inhibited. So higher structures go, who cares? That's novelty, but I don't care. It's not life-threatening. You don't need to bring that to consciousness. So the forebrain, the diencephalon, which is part of higher levels of the brain, just above the brainstem, and the cerebellum all have serotonin and GABA. And so these shout-out messages go to these places, and then these places send back GABA and serotonin and say, shut up. Not important. But what is really critical here about sleep and adrenaline is in order for the brain waves to change, for you to wake up from sleep, it is initiated by a norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, in the brain. So it's not that it's a stress response, it's that it's finally a chemical messenger that says, all right, you've had enough sleep now. It's time to shift up back to alertness. Now, one of the challenges is if you've got high loads of adrenaline lingering in your system all the time, if you're highly aroused, you're going to wake up too easily. And this is partly the explanation for why some people will fall asleep but don't stay asleep. So your adrenaline comes up when I'm waking up, but not to a fight or flight response. But if I live at the top of my window of tolerance and my adrenaline and my cortisol are here all the time, then I am not going to have as easy a time as hitting that non-REM sleep, that deep level of sleep. So I need this chemical so that I don't have narcolepsy, so I'm not falling asleep in the middle of the day, but I don't need too much of it, or I'm never going to hit my restful phases. So this is why you need to understand the balance of these chemicals. So many of our kids, clients who have attention deficit, you're going to hear more about this in the next set, they seek adrenaline because they don't have enough intrinsic chemistry. But then when it's time to shut down, they don't have the mechanisms in their nervous systems to downshift or to easily shift back up. The switching gears may be faulty in their nervous systems. You'll see here at the bottom of this page, the science of sleep. This was another one of my references that I really enjoyed because it was so good. Mendelssohn is such a good writer at drawing from literature across so many articles in a summarizing way. So it is a reference that I recommend. Dopamine, another upregulator. Dopamine and sleep. And when you think dopamine, many of us think about Parkinson's. We think about cognition. We think about learning. Much of your dopamine is produced in the basal ganglia, which has got a lot to do with movement. And interesting, there is a lot to do with movement in sleep, which you're going to hear about shortly. And the midbrain and the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a very key structure here in sleep. This is where there's a lot of production of dopamine, and dopamine levels are necessary for REM. And because REM is a very active state of the brain, there is a high level of arousal happening during rapid eye movement. And so dopamine levels spike during this kind of sleep, and it has a lot to do with the organization of the frontal cortex. So interestingly, you have to be able to have alertness and upregulation of this chemistry in order for you to have rapid eye movement. So when you think about these populations that are low in dopamine, think about addiction. Think about different kinds of disorders that experience either high dopamine, schizophrenia, or low levels of dopamine. It has impact on rapid eye movement phases of sleep. And that's why I'm saying we need to understand these aspects when we do a deeper dive into our inquiry around individual diagnostic categories. Acetylcholine. What is it? It's really the most significant switcher in the brainstem that is kind of like, okay, you've just come into the relay station, the train station, and now we have to switch trains. Acetylcholine has a lot of directivity in switching phases. So the release of acetylcholine from the cortex is very high when you're awake. That's how alpha and beta wave is driven. The cholinergic system is really, I'm here, I'm awake, I'm alert, I'm engaged, and I'm organized. But it's also very important for REM sleep. The acetylcholine system switches off in non-REM sleep. So you really see dramatic seesaw levels of up and down in this chemical during different phases of sleep. So it's important to understand how the serotonin, who is the conductor, but the acetylcholine actually changes the track so that the train goes in a different direction. And the serotonin says to the acetylcholine, time to do that. And that's how these phases and chemicals work together. As I'm speaking, I am thinking to myself, and want to remind you that it will be important that when we have our Q&A session, that you reflect on and become curious about the pieces that I'm saying so that we can have a dialogue about things that you want to understand more when we do meet in our Q&A session. Why do we have this rapid eye thing? It's a phenomenon that we know a lot about as far as we've been studying it for decades, but we really don't know why we do it. Dogs, cats, they also have rapid eye movements. The effects of rapid eye movement sleep deprivation are less severe than the lack of deep sleep. So non-REM is really the critical place where our health and restoration of the brain happens. But rapid eye is when you have the most vivid dreams. And there is a perception that it's during this phase that our emotional regulation happens. That we get to practice in the unconscious, dealing with emotions that we may not encounter or that we may not organize in our day-to-day lives. And so aspects of triggered implicit memories surface during this phase of sleep. In my experience of working with trauma survivors, dreams are a real problem for them. This is where night terrors happen, where challenges with re-experiencing a trauma happen because the implicit memory system is no longer suppressed in this phase of sleep. So it is an opportunity. It may sound Freudian to you as we talk about dreaming, but it is an opportunity for an introspective consideration of our emotional hardware in this phase of when we sleep. REM sleep is hugely active. This is freaky to me. You're about 90 minutes after you fall asleep. Look at how lit up this brain is. It lights up, and there's so much going on. It's like the brain is living in an altered reality during this phase. Now, REM sleep duration is variable. Sometimes it's really short, sometimes it's long, sometimes it progresses across the night. It's not the same in one person from day to day. So the first cycle may last only a short amount of time, and then it might get longer, or some nights you might only have brief episodes of REM sleep. So that's why its function in your regulatory of your health role is less of its primary emphasis, because it has more variability in the duration and the extensiveness of it. When Bob was editing this slide, he was like, wow, Kim, there's a lot of words there. It's so interesting when we're trying to deeply understand all of this, how to make it simple. And when you read the handouts, they don't make sense without the explanation. So it's important to have the context to these words. So when you look at the level of brain activity in the picture of rapid eye movement, it makes it look like there's more activity there than when we're awake. It's actually true and not true. Compared to being awake, some areas of the brain are way more active. And in some areas of the brain, way less active. It's almost like I said, a paradoxical reality. So the limbic brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the anterior cingulate, the right orbital frontal cortex, structures that I talk about all the time in attachment and trauma, are highly activated during REM sleep. That's where all your developmental trauma, your history lies, in that circuitry. And so these parts of the brain are your subconscious brain, and they are highly available in rapid eye movement. But your logic, linear, conscious brain is not active. So rational thought is not available to you in REM sleep. Rapid eye movements are associated with attention, arousal, and emotion. Isn't this a freaky picture? Your eyes are moving underneath your eyelids as if they're looking at something. And there's a real mixed EEG pattern in REM. Rapid, sharp peaks of EEG. It's like, whoa, something just lit up here. And the eyes start tracking underneath the eyelids as if they're looking at something. Eye movements are not present throughout the entire phase of REM. This we don't understand yet. Why call it rapid eye movement, sleep, if the eyes aren't actually moving? So there's a density, the amount of time the eye is moving versus the amount of time when the eyes aren't moving. is called rapid eye movement density within the REM phase. And it seems that this density has meaning. That when there is an increased amount of conjugate movements of the eyes, there is a greater degree of processing happening. And in those little breaks, it's kind of like the brain is having some subtle switching underneath, and there is changes at the level of the mitochondria. So this has to do with those little furnaces, because whenever there's high levels of metabolic activity, like this, you're going to need more of those furnaces. So in those little breaks, when there's less REM density, the mitochondria become more healthy in those phases. And this has got to do with the repair and restoration of our energy levels. So we know that REM is part of the restoration of our energy in our daily lives. So rapid eye movement seems to give us more energy. I'm thinking that you might be thinking, well, if there is more breaks in the REM density, that then there will be more energy. This is part of the unknown, that we don't really understand this relationship, at least in my level of learning, at the level that I'm at right now. There doesn't seem to be a level of understanding about the purpose of this fluctuation of density of eye movement versus non-eye movement during REM sleep. And we're just beginning to understand this aspect of this phase of sleep. One of the challenges, speaking from a menopausal woman's perspective, is REM sleep is a switcher where body temperature goes up, your heart rate changes, your acetylcholine goes up, you breathe faster. This is where hot flashes happen. And this is where sleep apnea sometimes comes online. We're going to talk more about that in our next session. But REM sleep has within it a whole host of potential challenges that we perceive only during these phases. Wow, everything you wanted to know about sleep, but we're afraid to ask. Did you know that your muscles get paralyzed during rapid eye movement sleep? Because your brain is so active. Your brain is so active, your body would be active if your muscles weren't shut off. So the pons, where the switchers happen to move you into REM sleep, there is this signal that goes to the cerebellum that then turns off the neurons that send messages to your muscles. And this prevents you from acting out your dreams, which is a good thing, so that you don't hit the other person that you're sleeping with, or as they say, damage property. So there is a temporary muscle paralysis during this active phase. And the neurons in the spinal cord are atonic. This does not happen to the muscles of respiration or to the eye muscles. Those are the only two groups of musculature that are still active in their messaging from the nervous system. I love this photo. So all muscles are paralyzed except for your respiratory and your ocular muscles. And this happens in the medulla, and which is way down, like this high above the spinal cord. And that's where this is initiated. Glycine, which we have not mentioned, is a neurochemical, and this happens directly from the medulla right down to the spinal cord, where all the little motor units in the spinal cord are shut down. And your muscles truly do relax. One neurotransmitter we haven't spoken about is glutamate. Glutamate is also an excitatory neurotransmitter. And glutamate is released from the brainstem to the spinal cord, leading up to the muscle relaxation. So it's very interesting because if I don't have these two alternating phenomenon, I'll stay either stuck in sleep or stuck in wakefulness. I gotta have the alternating chemicals to take me in and out of these different phases. So neurons using glutamate go down from the brainstem to the spinal cord, leading to the muscle relaxation seen in REM sleep. But we also need that glutamate-glycine relationship. So glycine shuts off the alpha motor neurons, but the glutamate is what starts that process of kicking in that glycine. And then the glutamate comes back on to bring the muscles back into a more activated state. So let me make sure you understand that. Glutamate is like the messenger that says on and off, on and off. It helps us relax, triggers glycine, and helps us come back into alertness and arousal. And glutamate is such a precarious neurotransmitter that is affected epigenetically in so many syndromes. And so we need to understand that, especially in motor disorders, you'll see where glutamate becomes the problem, where the muscles actually don't relax, restless leg syndrome. And you won't actually shift from this place of active musculature into relaxation, atonia, and then back into wakefulness. And Parkinson's, the dopamine-glutamate relationship makes it very difficult for the muscles to let go into that atonic state, into that restful state. So we'll visit this more in our next session. Lots to think about. Now we're going to shift into understanding how do memories actually consolidate? How do they become nicely organized? I talked earlier about neuroplasticity, which is this phenomenon of brain cells can grow. We call it synaptogenesis, where we develop new brain cells. And that's what adult-born neurons are. They are newly formed neurons in adult life. We used to think when a cell in the brain dies, that was it. Now we understand that we make brain cells until we stop breathing. And the hippocampus is a very important place in the brain. If we talk about dementia, if we talk about trauma, hippocampus is the director of memory and learning. And it is vulnerable to cortisol, adrenaline, toxins. Cell death is very easy to happen in this area of your brain. And so memory is a very, very vulnerable function of sleeplessness. Because during sleep, you actually create new synaptogenic adult-born neurons in your memory center. And when this happens, This new cell development contributes to the health of long-term memory storage throughout your lifespan. So REM is all about implicit memory, remember, emotional memory, subconscious, and non-REM is all about what did I have for breakfast. The hippocampus is involved in both of these forms of memory. And when I switch from phase to phase, my hippocampus does different things. And so memory consolidation, which is putting together thinking and feeling, needs me to have both of these phases of sleep. I need to be able to organize my emotions and organize my linear language logic in order to have consolidated, integrated life experiences. And this is where it happens, inside of the hippocampus. So whenever I have disruptions in sleep, in these different phases, it will affect the health of the synaptogenesis in the hippocampus, which is going to be less capable in integrating my memories. But I also won't have those different conditions necessary to put my experiences together. So you see, this is why we need to have all these different periods of time, the purpose of sleep, in order for our life to be as functional as possible. Occupational therapists are all about function. So wisely, the request to have this conversation about sleep is pretty wow, because none of our other functions are as capable without this survival function. Okay, the autonomic nervous system, which is our fight, flight, rest, and restore. My daughter, when she was little, she used to call it the automatic nervous system because it runs in the subconscious. Sympathetic is fight, flight, freeze. Parasympathetic, vagal, rest, and restore. I always thought sleep was only parasympathetic. Not the case. What you're going to find out is it's a combination of the two. During REM sleep, there is a lot of sympathetic nervous system action. Isn't that wow? So you're now discovering that REM is a highly aroused state. We just don't think of it because your muscles are paralyzed. So the sympathetic nervous system, high arousal, REM. And typically, this system is reserved for emergencies. And the sympathetic output, which is so vast in your body, puts out adrenaline throughout the whole body. So I think of REM sleep in a way to be a freeze response because you're immobilized, but you're highly aroused. And that's why it's such a dissociative, disconnected, disembodied state where all that dreaming is so vastly vivid in that experience. Whereas deep sleep is truly rest and restore, and your vagus nerve is highly online during this form of sleep. And this is where you use your acetylcholine. It's all about, please just let me restore myself, rest. And that's where the salivary glands, the heart rate variability, your gut motility, your bladder, all of these things, they shift into this restful state. Problem when, as you age, you got a little bit more energy in these structures. Many people, as they age, they have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. That is a sympathetic signal from the bladder, which takes you out of that deep sleep. And so we see autonomic disturbances that happen as a result of these changes in our physiology across our lifespan. Genes and sleep. I love to talk about epigenetics. Epigenetics is the interaction between our genes and the environment. But I didn't know that we had genes specifically designed to regulate sleep. And these genes, these particular ones, they change in their expression constantly over a 24-hour period. They are constantly replicating, and they're all about circadian rhythms. They're called circadian genes. And there is a place in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic hypothalamic nucleus. This is the boss of rhythms in your day-to-day cycles. And it's driven by genes. And so interesting, when we look at jet lag, these genes are like, what are you doing to me? And they replicate in an altered way, which changes your melatonin production. And the genes have to then recalibrate to the new time and the new light levels in which you're in. So genes, these are very adaptive genes. And what's so fascinating to me is these same genes also are responsible for controlling mood, motivational behaviors, sexual behavior. They also are responsible for how much you want to eat. They regulate your stress response. They regulate inflammation in the body. And these same genes have more than one function. That's because anytime a gene is responsible for more than one function, it's because those functions are tied together in our functional, physiological, everyday working. So if there's disruption in any one of those, they affect the others. So if I have a problem with sleep, I'm going to have a problem with mood, motivation, inflammation, stress regulation, and arousal. If I have problems with inflammation, I'm going to have trouble with sleep, motivation, mood, stress response. Wow. They are interconnected forces. So for me, when I think about things like transgenerational transmission of trauma, where legacies of trauma are passed on from one generation to another, one of the most profound places where genes are affected by stress are the circadian genes. So sleeplessness and anxiety and psychiatric disorders, they're all in the same codes at the genetic level. So for me, that's huge. That if I can shift one of those functions, I can impact them all. Stay tuned. Don't go to that, what am I going to do now place with this client yet. Just sink into that new awareness of the level of physiological interaction that happens and why functions are so interconnected and why we need to treat clients holistically. This is not about, I give you this tool and it will take care of all of your challenges. It's like spokes on a bicycle wheel. Multiple problems feed into a single challenge. And I may need multiple tools to support a single challenge. When we think about so many neurodevelopmental disabilities, we have to understand the reticular activating system. When we're talking about autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, sensory processing disorder, any type of psychiatric challenge, which we're about to head into in our next session, we need to have a foundation of understanding about the reticular activating system. I was first introduced to this phenomenon way back probably in the 90s, mid-90s, and have been trying to understand the impact of this neural network for over 20 years. It is, in fact, a network, a diffuse network, which means it's everywhere. And these cells run in an upward direction from the brainstem with its first stopover in the thalamus. Well, this is important for people who are interested in sensory processing because the thalamus is like central station in understanding the train network in Hong Kong. It is a relay station for sensory information. And the thalamus is kind of like a mini brain within a brain where early preliminary discrimination of sensation is determined. So it's kind of like the thalamus says, that is touch. That is visual. That is auditory. Whereas in the reticular activating system, it's just data. It's not discernible in the brainstem what the specifics of the data is. So at the brainstem level in the reticular activating system, sensory information is kind of like, I'm going to use the word noise. Information that comes in and just activates many aspects of the brain. Whereas at the thalamus, there is an actual discernment with more detail of what the sensations are. So this reticular activating system lies between the cortex and the midbrain. So it's really medulla and pons. And 100% of the input into this system, which is responsible for arousal, is sensation. And this is why we need to understand it so profoundly in our work as occupational therapists. As I just said, the reticular activating system delivers nonspecific, generic sensory stimulation all the way up to the cortex. But it goes through the thalamus to get there. And its job is to increase alertness, arousal, senses of precursors for attention. So it's a shout out to the brain that says something is coming in that requires the brain's consciousness. We also see the reticular activating system sending sensory input to the cortex through the hypothalamus. So one relay station, central station, another relay station, Aberdeen station, or Simsat-Joy. They are different relays and stopovers where data is sorted and used for different purposes. The hypothalamus has everything to do with sleep and everything to do with creating rhythms in the body. It also is the director of our hormonal functions. So isn't it interesting that sensation has an impact on hormones. This is why Lisa said about her mummy many years ago, "Mummy, I think you're a psychoneuroimmunoendocrinologist," which means everything is connected to everything. What we think translates into neurotransmitter, neural network activity. That neural network activity impacts our immune systems and impacts our hormonal system. They are a holistic, interactive network of chemical and electrical signals. When we are sleeping, the reticular activating system is deactivated to some degree, but sensory input is still moving through this neural network that can wake us up. It's kind of like our threat detector. And one of the things you're going to hear me talk about in the next session is how people with sensory sensitivity have a challenge with this, where their sensory sensitivity keeps the reticular activating system open and more vigilant even in sleep. And this has been determined to be a significant challenge for kids on the spectrum, for kids with sensory processing issues, and for people with anxiety and trauma. So that interaction between alertness, vigilance, survival, because it's got a role in fight, fright, and freeze, that those roles of interaction can kindle or prime the reticular activating system to be more alert, which could definitely impact your ability to hit deeper levels of sleep and have a greater ease of wakefulness while sleeping. Orchids, as I call them. So what's this hypothalamus about? Well, the hypothalamus, which is very central and core in the brain, has a particular nucleus within it. It has many different conglomerations of cells. Nuclei are like little countries on the world map. So when you have a nucleus, it would be kind of like Switzerland. The Switzerland of sensory processing would be the thalamus. So this little country of the hypothalamus, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is all about creating circadian rhythms. The circadian rhythms are rhythms of sleep, wake, intake of food, being able to manage the stress response. So melatonin is produced here. And melatonin is the regulator of these rhythms that I spoke about when we talked about genetics earlier in this workshop today, around how those genes have multiple functions and the circadian rhythm genes have multiple functions. Well, here it is in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, where there is multiple roles for the single conglomeration of cells. So this is why people who have difficulty with one of these functions will likely have difficulty with all of these functions. Think about the number of kids that we support, kids and adults, that we support that have both eating, feeding, and sleep related. Regulatory functions are a big role of this nucleus in the hypothalamus. The pineal gland. It's always been referred to as sort of like the seat of the soul. Produces some pretty unique aspects of chemistry. The DMT molecule, which has a lot to do with disembodiment, disconnection from your body, has a great degree to do with dreaming. But this neuroendocrine gland, which is highly connected to the hypothalamus, also secretes melatonin. So what's interesting here in the pineal gland is that there are photoreceptors in the back of your eye. And those photoreceptors, they register levels of illumination. This is very pertinent to my husband, Bob, who wakes up the minute there is light in the bedroom. Because even though he is sleeping, light is making it through his eyelids, hitting the photoreceptors in the back of his sensitive eye, and immediately going to the hypothalamus. And this then triggers that sympathetic nervous system channel we talked about earlier that starts to increase wakefulness. So adrenaline comes on, and you see this inverse relationship between the melatonin production, which keeps you in that sedated space, and this raise in adrenaline and wakefulness state, and it has a lot to do with light and the pineal gland's registration of light. So we know that melatonin secretion increases in the evening before we go to sleep because it helps us get ready to enter into that sleep state. And so many different developmental diagnoses have difficulty with the timing of the onset of the production of melatonin. Sometimes it happens 2 hours later for many different developmental disabilities. So typically, melatonin starts to kick in 2 hours before your typical bedtime. And a lot of that has to do with the light change. I used to live in the Arctic of Canada, where for 6 months of the year, it was bright almost all the time. And for the other 6 months of the year, it was dark almost all of the time. And this definitely messes with your circadian rhythm. We used to put black garbage bags on our windows so that you could sleep in the summertime. But many of the Inuit would stay awake for long periods of time in the summer and just rest when they felt like it. So typically, this melatonin production is stimulated by shifts in illumination. And throughout the night, melatonin goes up and up and up. And it reaches its peak between 2 and 4 a.m. And then it starts to fall off. And interestingly, that's when a lot of people who have insomnia where they can't stay sleeping, it's as this melatonin production starts to reduce that they will enter or re-enter into wakefulness because they're more sensitive to these changes within their circadian rhythm. So during the day, you still have some melatonin, but it's at very low levels. And it's part of keeping the pump of, you know how when you have a well and you have to pump the handle of the well to get the water to flow, there needs to be water in the pipe. Well, there needs to be melatonin in the system in order for it to be used and useful in your sleep maintenance. Wow, this is one of my favorite parts of the conversation because I'm very interested in the immune system, in inflammation, in how the brain stays healthy, especially as it relates to autism, dementia, memory. And this information around sleep and cleaning up the brain is very new. So even in the last 5 years, we've just started to begin to understand how the brain cleans itself up to minimize proteins that shouldn't be in there, garbage, as we would say. So neurons that fire constantly. So if you're like me today, on fire in your brain activity, and you're aroused and you're thinking and you're creative and you're alert and you're engaged, in order for your brain to participate in those functions, it spews out a lot of free radicals because you've used up a lot of energy in the brain, metabolic energy, in order to engage in those functions. So toxic free radicals are a byproduct of great thinking. You know, it's a good, bad thing. But antioxidants are needed to mop up these toxins. This is a big problem, as you'll hear, in people with autism. The antioxidant people with cancer. Antioxidants are part of the oxidation reduction process of binding that takes chemicals out of the spaces where they shouldn't be. So antioxidants take the poisons out and they clean up the brain so that the brain cells don't die off, don't idle like, a car engine that's spitting out carbon dioxide. That the cell danger, the metabolic danger, is minimized in the brain. So all of this antioxidant activity is activated during sleep. Well, most organs in our body take care of the garbage by recruiting the immune system. They blow the whistle and they bring in cytokines and they bring in macrophages and the army shows up and Pac-Man eats the garbage. All the metabolic waste from your liver, from your gut, from your lungs, from your heart, whatever part of you, the immune system is like doing the job it needs to do, and then it dumps it into the lymphatic vessels. And then it's drained and taken away by your kidneys and your bowel. Clean out the garbage. The problem for the brain is, because of the blood-brain barrier, we don't have a lot of lymph vessels in the brain. So this is the role of glial cells. For so long, we have not known what the heck are all these glial cells doing in our brain. We have more glial cells in the brain than we do neurons. And scientists have always thought that where it's at in brain function is neurons. Now we're beginning to understand that's just the new frontier, is understanding glial cells. Another one of the books on my shelf that is this thick, without exaggeration, is called Glial Cells. What are they about? What are they for? Some of them help neuroplasticity, creating synaptogenesis, but astrocytes, a specific type of glial cell, is all about being the immune system of the brain. We also have glial cells that make myelin or support in making myelin sheaths. They're called oligodendrocytes. We have glial cells that are about propagation. They have to do with seizure activity. So astrocytes are the immune army of the brain. And these glial cells in the brain are like the pump that, like a dishwasher, go and scrub out all the cells, the enzymes of the soap that you put in your dishwasher, cleans all the cells and the toxins floating around in between all the interstitial space in your brain. Thank goodness. When awake, glial cells take a back seat to the neurons. but they do assist in the propagation of signals, but they're kind of like, they're the backseat driver. But during sleep, glial cells are the front seat driver, and they kick into action, and they slow the brain's electrical activity to about 1/3 of its peak frequency. So they're like messenger signals that say to the neurons, after I enter sleep, they shut propagation down in so much of the brain. And why they do this is what we call the glymphatic system. That's a new made-up word. Glial lymphatic system. So they call it the glymphatic system. And these Scandinavian scientists are my heroes because they are the most prolific writers and thinkers that I could read about what is happening in the immune repair of our brain. So this is cool. Sleeping brain cells shrink. Can you believe that? As the propagation of data diminishes in sleep, the glial cell says to the neurons, go to sleep now, turn off, and then it's like they retract in, like a plant pulling in its leaves. You know, some of nature's most amazing plants, when it's dark, they fold up and become small. This is what happens to neurons in many parts of your brain while you're sleeping. And we've talked about craniosacral therapy for years without very much understanding of the role of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. But cerebrospinal fluid in the brain and in the spinal cord is a part of the lymphatics of this cleanup system. And when the neurons pull back, the cerebrospinal fluid sloshes around like the water in your dishwasher, taking all the enzymes and cleaning up in between your cells. I hope that's a good visual for you. To me, it's like a dishwasher in the brain. Now, this cleansing happens when you're awake too, but it's not very much, only about 15%. And when you're sleeping, this is the time when all that repair and restore happens because you have so much more space for this sloshing around to happen. When I think about Bob, he had meningitis last year. And there was a lot of inflammation in his nervous system. And he would sleep all day long, maybe be awake, and it used to freak me out because his consciousness, he couldn't stay conscious. But when I read this part about brain injury and concussion, and it makes me think about how that sleep state is so incredibly important for the healing processes of the immune system of the brain. That during inflammation ironically is even though it changes function, it's a positive phenomenon because when there's inflammation, it's active in repair. So the brain is doing its sloshing and its antioxidant properties, and it's reorganizing the spaces in between the neurons so that brain can return to its optimum restored space. So we want cleanup, we just don't want it all the time. When we talk about autism, for example, we know that this blood-brain barrier in many neurodevelopmental disabilities is not typical. And toxins in the body that shouldn't be in the brain pass into the brain, which demands for more of this glymphatic activity. And So you see these vicious cycles. Many of our kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities don't sleep, so they have problems with their cleanup, and they have more toxins because they're dumping it into their brain because of the design of their being. So it's like a vicious cycle of increased inflammation from more toxins and insufficient time and mechanisms of sleep in order to repair and restore function. So you're going to hear me talk about how you'll see increased in repetitive behaviors, anxiety, problems with communication, correlated with sleeplessness. This is why this topic is so critical. I hope this part was interesting to you as it was interesting to me, because the immune system is such a big part of our entire health. The other correlation is between Alzheimer's, dementia, and sleep. And one of the greatest dangers to tip us epigenetically into cell danger for our brain health in our elder years is sleeplessness and chronic stress. What happens to our body on sleep? We have more bone building during sleep. So the way that our body metabolizes, uses calcium, and creates bone density relies on sleep. We break down sugars from our diet, and we have a greater use of our food for metabolic rates. This is how it connects to weight loss during the process of sleep. And there is lots of research that shows that chronic sleep deprivation increases appetite as well as decreases your capacity to lose weight. Obesity is highly correlated to sleeplessness. So you think about sleep apnea, which we'll talk about later, which interrupts your sleep, being sleep deprived, and obesity. They are often highly interconnected. You also see muscle repair happen during sleep, cleaning up of lactic acid, cleaning up of tendon and connective tissue and fascial tears and injuries as a process of the immune's response that happens while you're sleeping. And of course, all that we just spoke about when you are flushing out your brain. Sleep deprivation. Again, what we know is we could, in fact, do a workshop on each slide. So you are invited here to consider small chunks of time reflecting on bite sizes of contributions to your thinking with respect to sleep. Of course, we don't consciously deprive humans of sleep, and we do awful things to rats. But research shows that rats that are restricted in the amount of sleep they experience, over several weeks, they begin to become sleepy when they're supposed to be active, and they have more difficulty falling asleep when they're supposed to go to sleep. And when they do sleep, their brainwave activity and their REM and non-REM phases change. Chicken or egg. Vicious cycle. And I know this from jet lag, how hard it is sometimes when your sleep regime, your sleep hygiene becomes altered and hijacked, how hard it is to reorganize it back to its regular rhythm, because it cyclically changes all of the functions of sleep. And if this becomes chronic, it changes your neurodevelopmental processes. I listened to one YouTube video that was a part of the promotion of this particular module here on ADHD. And the author of this YouTube video, he said, I'm not sure that it is ADHD because sleep deprivation, inattention, lack of concentration, it's hard to, what's causing what? If I'm hyper aroused in my brain, can't shut my brain down, need lots and lots of stimulation, interrupts sleep. Interrupted sleep decreases concentration, impulsivity, and attention, and it goes around in a loop tape. So to say, this is a disability isn't really probably accurate enough or holistic enough. I had the opportunity to attend the National Institute of Mental Health conference several years ago, and Thomas Insel, who is the president of the NIMH at the time, he said, the way we diagnose mental health related disorders in the DSM-5 is not good enough. We need to think beyond diagnoses. We need to look at all human functions holistically in order to individualize the interventions for our patients. And so this topic of sleep deprivation makes me think about that conversation, because we look at our clients based on the labels that they have when they come to us. And when you go behind the scenes, behind the label, and you look at the neurobiological, metabolic, immunological, hormonal, contextual factors, there's so much comorbidity. Trauma, sleep deprivation, and anxiety. This is the number one cause of sleep interruption is anxiety. And I think about this current pandemic of collective trauma, of all the different challenges that are happening in the world today. Anxiety is a very significant problem. And sleep, which reduces anxiety, is hijacked by anxiety. So deprivation, it changes all the functions, especially our executive functions. When you have acute sleep loss, which means I'm cramming for an exam, or I got to meet a deadline, what you will find is that there will be a decreased ability to store information from the day. So, and this declines over time. So you might be able to pull it off when you're 20, but when you're 57, you can't pull it off anymore. That sleep for memory and collaborative thinking is essential. And the other thing that happens in acute sleep deprivation is that if you decide to have a drink, that alcohol is biased by the sleep deprivation to be more sedative. And, if we talk about addiction, which we will, you can see how that feeds into itself. If you're anxious and you can't sleep, you could start wanting to have a glass of wine every night to try and get to sleep. But you will eventually need more and more and more of it to have the same impact. So alcohol sensitivity changes under the conditions of acute sleep deprivation. And although the mechanism of that is not clearly understood, it is perceived that that has to do with an alteration at the GABA receptor sites, which is all about sedation and downshifting into states of relaxation. You also can see, under the conditions of acute sleep deprivation, changes in mood mildly. You can feel a little more depressed, more anxious, a little bit edgy, irritable, paranoid, worried. These types of regulatory emotional components are altered, and we all know it. We say things like, I didn't sleep very well last night, so I'm not in a very good space today. And it's not just a perceptive experience, it's a biological outcome of a crappy night's sleep. What are some long-term impacts physiologically with chronic sleep deprivation? Increased diastolic blood pressure. Crap, right? Where the blood pressure, because the sympathetic nervous system has a bias. So if I don't hit non-REM sleep and shift into that parasympathetic phase, I have more of a bias in that sympathetic arousal. One of the things that I do that I'm going to talk about in tools is look at heart rate variability. I have a little heart rate variability finger measure. I take it in the morning, and it is matched to a sleep registration. And you can see how your heart rate variability is more variable, which is a good thing, on days when you've had a better sleep. Here it is, Bob said. He brought it right for me. So this is my heart rate variability measure. Talks to my iPhone. And in a 2.5 minute period, it registers how variable the spikes of my heart rate are. And we know that when there's a range of higher degrees, not too high, but higher degrees of heart rate variability, that means my vagal system, my parasympathetic nervous system, and my sympathetic nervous system are working in a symphonic harmony. And I'm able to handle stress better when I'm in that range. So if I have a crappy sleep, then my heart rate variability will usually go down and make it less, what's the word I want to use? Within my window of tolerance to manage stress in that day. So we also see that chronically over time, if I keep sympathetic dominant to the heart, then the blood pressure system calibration changes, and I will move into having higher blood pressure. So sleep is very important for managing through the autonomic nervous system your blood pressure. Chronic sleep deprivation changes your immune system. The natural killer cells, which are important for preventing tumors, for looking after cancer cells that may arise, and cytokines. And what happens here is that what it does is it changes the intensity frequency of the production and mobilization of these cells, both in autoimmune ways as well as in limited ways. So, for example, in cancers, certain kinds of cancers, you will see a drop in the percentage of certain immune cells. And in autoimmune disorders, you may see an exaggerated perception or number of immune cells in those clinical pictures. And both of these extremes are affected and altered by the quality and duration of your sleep. So autoimmune disorders and cancers, sleep is critical for that healing process. Now, I am not saying that any one of these things are causal. They are a soup of contributing factors. So if I have an epigenetic signature that makes me sensitive and vulnerable, and I have chronic sleep deprivation, then I am likely to flick the switches in my epigenetic profile, and it may move me into the direction of certain pathologies. So please don't be literal in your thinking about this, that sleep deprivation is a cause of a particular disorder or pathology. It is a contributing factor. Pain management. Pain interrupts sleep and also increases through deprivation of sleep, the kindling of sensitivity to pain. So again, chicken and egg. And this ties in also to inflammation. If I have inflammation in my joints, for example, which results in pain, which interrupts my sleep, I will have sleep deprivation, which interrupts my inflammatory process, which also then increases my pain. So do you see the hamster wheel of this? And of course, your mind is already probably at, well, what do I do about that? And I want to remind you that the best structure in the brain is called the cingulate gyrus, and it's called the power of the pause. This is the structure of wait. You have to wait for that yet to come in our future dialogues. The microbiome. I went to an 8-day conference on bacteria in your gut, if you can imagine. And you have more neurotransmitter production in your gut than you do in your head. And when there is altered bacteria in your gut, in relationship to your own specific epigenetic signature, then you're going to have interruptions in all of the processes involved in creating sleep. But chronic sleep deprivation also changes the health of your gut. So they have a symbiotic interaction. So if I don't sleep, this little planet in here filled with inhabitants of bacteria, some are good and some are not so good, the balance of them becomes altered through this experience of sleep deprivation. And think about, a moment ago we talked about sugar and how we process our sugars, which we need for energy. If there's an imbalance in sugars, then we have more yeast in our gut, all of us. And that interacts and interferes with the health of the microbiome in your gut. So it's all this complex, interactive piece. And increase in appetite. It's like I start looking for energy from food because my storage of glycogen in my brain that I regenerate in my sleep isn't available to me. So I start eating chocolate, eating potato chips, going to things that are going to give me quick energy releases in order for me to stay alert and awake and available. And this is another outcome of chronic sleep deprivation that impacts the health of our physiology. I have a few more thoughts before we come to the conclusion of module number 1. I had the opportunity a few months ago to listen to an incredible conference on trauma in Ireland. This was in June. And one of the speakers that I adore is Severn Fisher. And she wrote the book Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, Calming the Fear-Driven Brain. And I bring this up here because this book, which was published in 2014, has been one of my Bibles in my love of my work of developmental trauma. And Severn has used neurofeedback, which we're going to talk about, as one of her modalities in altering trauma responses. And one of the measures, outcome measures, of the impact of her neurofeedback on trauma profiles is quality of sleep. So there are a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you in this module on the science of sleep comes from her elegant explanations of how arousal comes about in the brain. So one of the things that she does in her description of sleep is talk about how EEGs, electroencephalogram measures, can identify different profiles of neural activation in the brain that may contribute to challenges with many functions, but one of them being sleep. We have a network in the brain called the default mode network. And this is a loop, and it can be seen in diffusion tensor imaging, which is incredible. You can see individual neurons talking to each other in real time. Very different than MRI, which just looks at energy use by single structures. Diffusion tensor imaging shows us how structures talk to each other and how efficient those circuits are working. So the default mode network is what our brain does when we are not thinking, when our mind is wandering, when we are in a state of relax. This default mode network is very important for the regulation of the entire brain. And what happens in people who experience high anxiety and trauma is that they have another network that is overactive, and it's called the salience network. And this is a completely different loop that is all about measuring threat. And in order for your brain to be its ultimate state of competence, there has to be a balance between the salience network activation and the default mode network. Your default mode network is the part of you that enables you to have self-reflective capacity, mindfulness, the ability for self-reflection. It's this consciousness of the human experience, which is why we know meditation, mindfulness is a healing component that contributes to sleep. So when you have high anxiety, trauma, an orchid-like sensitive brain, the salience network dominates the default mode network, and it short circuits cognitive capacity for self-reflection, for self-regulation. So she talks a lot about, in her work, activating through neurofeedback the default mode network and minimizing the salience network so that there is a greater balance. I mean, we still need to have threat detection if we're going to survive, but we want to have it so that I'm not orienting with salience to the fluffies in my socks. So this allows the brain to use all of its networks. It's kind of like the big boss of other networks that allow us to shift in states of arousal. She has found that the right brain and the left brain, which this comes from all of my thinking around attachment, that they have different functions in regulation of states. And if the left brain is low in energy, if it's, kind of in its activation, and we'll talk about which kind of developmental disabilities that shows up in our next session, it shows this shows up in sleep. So an under-aroused, under-reactive left hemisphere in comparison to typical brain development, you're going to see night sweats, frequent waking without agitation, light sleep or too much sleep, sleep apnea, non-obstructive, snoring, not rested after sleep, waking early, and difficulty falling asleep with a quiet mind. So a lot of us are walking around with this profile, where this side of the brain's lack of relationship with this side of the brain interferes with certain functions of sleep. There is a bridge between the two hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And this bridge is highly interactive in the sleep organization. And we see problems with the corpus callosum in developmental trauma and also in developmental disabilities. And as a result, we also see specific profiles of sleep disturbance. Severin Fisher talks about this is the situation when there's imbalances of information, and you see this in people with many psychiatric disorders, personality disorder, for example, between the two hemispheres. You'll see night terrors, nocturnal myoclonus, lots of jerkiness while sleeping. So that atonic function that I spoke about earlier is not well controlled. Sleepwalking, narcolepsy, mania, night sweats. Interesting about night sweats. That's a topic for later for sure. Bedwetting and sleep paralysis. These are poorly integrated signals between the two hemispheres. This one is mine. So this is the one I'm the most interested in. And this is high arousal, underactivated right hemisphere. And this particular situation happens the most in attachment challenges. That right orbital frontal cortex, when it is altered in early childhood, creates a challenge in the stabilizing force of that right hemisphere in inhibiting the limbic brain, because that's the role of the right brain. The right brain's job is to tell the amygdala that it's safe and okay. So if I'm highly aroused because I don't have enough inhibition, then my right brain is not active enough in its role to quieten my stress response. And here you see difficulty falling asleep because of a busy mind, hot flashes, physically restless sleep, turning over all the time, not finding a comfortable position. Bruxism, which means grinding my teeth or clenching my teeth. Nightmares or vivid dreams, restless leg syndrome. Waking in agitation, being agitated and irritable in the morning, and vigilant sleep. There's not a deep drop. And this is so common in menopause. Estrogen, which functions as a serotonin enhancer, I'm going to say it that way. When that estrogen goes away in menopause, then the right brain has an even greater difficulty in quieting that limbic brain. And these become symptoms that are commonly seen in that menopausal era. Dreaming. Here's another topic we could have a whole workshop on. Dreams happen during both REM and non-REM sleep. But during non-REM sleep, the dreams are more concept-based, whereas REM sleep dreams are more vivid and emotional and intense. So they come from And we don't really understand this. So there is a sense, and this comes from sleep studies and dream journals and matching different phases of sleep, waking people up, asking them what they were experiencing, trying to understand dream state. So we do know that it happens throughout the night, but in different ways. There are certain kinds of brainwaves, and they happen mostly when dreaming during REM, and they're called PGOs, affectionately. Ponto-geniculo-occipital waves. Pons, geniculate, which is thalamic, and occipital circuits. And these waves contribute to the visual experience that you have when you're dreaming. And the more dense these waves, the more vivid your dreams. So PGO waves, which we see in sleep studies, are associated with the visual element of dreams and have a lot to do with those conjugate eye movements that are moving back and forth in underneath your eyelids while you're dreaming. Now, in my research, what I tried to do was look for resources that were in the last 3 to 4 years tops. Because when you think about what we are learning about sleep, the mechanisms of sleep, the biology of sleep, and the outcome of sleep deprivation, this is a constantly changing science. And so what I'm hoping has happened in this first module is that the groundwork has been laid for our conversations as to how the function of sleep is affected in so many populations that we as occupational therapists support.